first thing I heard wasn't someone saying hello. It was laughter, not the kind that comes from a good joke. The kind people make when they've already decided you're the punchline. I had barely stepped through the old wooden gate before my cousin Jason spotted me from across the backyard. He lifted a bottle of local craft beer like he was about to make a toast, then grinned so wide I knew exactly what was coming. "Well, would you look at that?" He called out loud enough for everyone near the grill to hear. Claire actually remembered we're still family. A few people laughed, not because it was especially funny, because Jason always expected an audience. I smiled anyway. "Good to see you too." He gave me that look people reserve for someone they've already figured out years ago. "You still hiding up there in Wyoming?" "I still like quiet." That earned another round of chuckles. I wasn't surprised. Families have a strange habit of freezing you in time. No matter how much your life changes, they'll keep talking to the version of you they created 20 years ago. To them, I wasn't Claire Donovan. I was the quiet cousin, the woman who disappeared into the military, came back divorced, never had children, bought a little cabin outside Cody, worked some job nobody really understood, and somehow always looked perfectly content being alone. People don't trust that, especially family. The reunion was being held on my grandmother, Eleanor's ranch, just outside Livingston, Montana. She had turned 75 that week, and my aunt insisted every branch of the family come home. The place looked exactly the way it always had, pickup trucks parked beside split-rail fences, kids chasing each other across yellow grass, a Labrador stealing hot dogs whenever nobody was watching, country music drifting from an old Bluetooth speaker balanced on a cooler, the smell of mesquite smoke mixing with fresh-cut hay. If you grew up in this part of America, it felt like summer itself had a smell. I carried the blueberry pie I'd baked that morning into the outdoor kitchen and kissed Grandma on the cheek. "There you are," she whispered, squeezing my hand a little longer than usual. "You drove all that way. 6 hours. You should have flown." I laughed softly. "I spend enough time around helicopters." She smiled, but I caught the tiny shadow crossing her face. She always worried more than she admitted. Grandma was one of the few people who never asked uncomfortable questions about my years in uniform. Maybe she understood something everyone else didn't. Sometimes love knows when silence is kindness. The afternoon settled into its familiar rhythm. My younger cousins argued over college football. Someone started a horseshoe tournament. The older men debated cattle prices and politics. Meanwhile, I found myself doing what I always did at family gatherings: filling pitchers with lemonade, carrying folding chairs, washing serving trays before anyone asked, staying just outside the center of every conversation. Peace is easier than explaining yourself, especially when explaining yourself means reopening doors you've spent years trying to close. Around 4 o'clock, Jason wandered over again. He had switched from beer to bourbon. That usually meant trouble. "So, Claire," he said loudly, "still teaching those rescue classes?" "I am. Anybody actually need that stuff? A lot more people than you'd think." He laughed. "I guess somebody's got to teach rich tourists how not to fall off mountains." Several relatives smiled politely. I simply nodded. I'd learned a long time ago that not every comment deserves a response. Sometimes people aren't looking for a conversation. They're looking for permission to keep talking. Jason had always been that way. Loud, confident, funny enough to keep a crowd around him. Too confident to notice when he'd crossed a line. He wasn't cruel in the way truly bad people are. He just mistook embarrassment for entertainment. There is a difference. Unfortunately, the person being embarrassed rarely feels it. I walked toward the barn to grab another bag of ice when I noticed an unfamiliar black SUV rolling slowly up the gravel driveway. It wasn't one of the family vehicles. The engine shut off. The driver's door opened. An older man stepped out, tall, lean, gray hair cut short, dark sunglasses. Even before he straightened his back, I recognized the posture. Military, not active duty anymore. But once you've spent enough years around service members, you learn that some things never disappear. The way they scan a room, the way they stand, the way silence follows them. My uncle hurried over with a broad smile. "There he is." The two men embraced. Then Uncle Roy raised his voice. "Everybody, this is Colonel Ethan Brooks. We worked together years back on a veterans aviation charity." People waved. Hands were shaken. Introductions were exchanged. Nothing unusual. Until Ethan reached me. He offered his hand. I took it. For just a second, his grip tightened. His sunglasses slipped down slightly as he looked directly into my face. Recognition. Then confusion. Then something else I couldn't quite place. His eyes lingered half a heartbeat longer than they should have. "You've got a familiar face," he said quietly. "I get that sometimes." I smiled politely and let go. He didn't answer. Instead, he watched me walk away. I felt it between my shoulder blades. That feeling you get when someone is trying to remember a name they haven't spoken in decades. I told myself I was imagining it. Life has a funny way of convincing you that old chapters stay closed. Most of the time they do. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right person to walk through the gate. As the Montana sun drifted lower behind the mountains, I caught Ethan looking toward me again from across the yard. Not smiling, not confused anymore, just studying me. Then, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear, he whispered to himself, "Impossible." Around 5 in the afternoon, the light over the Montana hills began to soften, turning the fields behind Grandma Eleanor's ranch into shades of gold. Someone started passing around slices of pie, while my uncle fired up another batch of steaks on the grill. The younger kids had traded tag for a game of catch, and every few seconds you could hear somebody yell, "Heads up," before a football sailed across the yard. On the surface, it looked like every American family gathering I'd ever known. Underneath, though, I could feel something changing. Every time I looked up, Colonel Ethan Brooks seemed to be somewhere nearby. He wasn't staring in a rude way. It was worse than that. He looked like a man trying to fit together pieces of a puzzle that shouldn't exist. I kept telling myself it meant nothing. Faces remind people of old friends all the time. 25 years is a long time. People age. Memories blur. Besides, I'd spent most of those years making sure that chapter of my life stayed exactly where it belonged. In the past. I was carrying a tray of sweet iced tea onto the patio when Ethan stepped beside me. "Need a hand?" "I'm all right." He took one pitcher anyway. "You said you teach rescue courses." "I do, for the state?" "Sometimes." "For private companies?" "Sometimes." He smiled just a little. "You answer every question with one word. It keeps conversations short." That earned the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him all afternoon. I used to know someone who answered exactly like that. I didn't ask who. Instead, I thanked him for helping with the drinks and walked back toward the tables. Some conversations are dangerous because they sound harmless. Jason, unfortunately, had discovered his second bourbon. Anyone who knew him understood what that meant. His volume doubled. His judgment disappeared. His need for an audience became almost impossible to ignore. He slapped my cousin Mark on the shoulder and pointed toward me. "Look at Claire over there." A few heads turned. "Always working." Someone chuckled. Jason continued, "I swear she's allergic to having fun." "I am having fun," I answered without looking up from arranging cups. "That's your idea of fun?" "It is." He laughed louder. "You've always been the serious one." Nobody interrupted him. Families often don't realize they're encouraging someone simply by staying silent. Jason wasn't trying to be cruel. At least, that's what everyone always said afterward. "Jason's just joking. Jason doesn't mean anything by it. Jason's always been like that." Funny how those excuses always protect the loudest person in the room, never the quietest. I poured another glass of lemonade for Grandma before sitting beside her for a few minutes. She reached over and patted my hand. "You all right?" "I've been through worse family reunions." She smiled knowingly. "You always were better at hiding hurt than your mother." That sentence stayed with me. Because she was right. I learned that from Mom. She grew up in a small farming town where people believed strength meant never letting anyone see you cry. She used to tell me something every time I left for another deployment. "Don't waste your energy explaining yourself. People who love you won't need it. People who don't won't believe it anyway." At the time, I thought she was talking about neighbors. Years later, I realized she had been talking about life. Jason wandered over again before I could disappear back into the kitchen. "So tell me something. Here we go. You ever think about getting married again?" A few relatives exchanged awkward looks. I shrugged. "Not really. No kids. Nope. No husband. No. No boyfriend?" I smiled. "I have a very spoiled golden retriever." That actually made several people laugh. Jason pointed toward me dramatically. See? That's what I'm talking about. He turned toward everyone else. Claire spent 20 years in the military and came home married to a dog. The laughter this time felt different. Not vicious, but careless. Like nobody had stopped to wonder whether there might be a reason my life looked different than theirs. I smiled because it was easier than explaining that I'd missed birthdays, weddings, funerals, anniversaries, first steps, graduations, and Christmas mornings. Not because I wanted to, because someone had to answer the call. People see the empty chair at Thanksgiving. They rarely think about where the person sitting there might have been instead. Ethan happened to be standing only a few feet away. His expression changed. Not anger, recognition, almost concern. He stepped forward. Jason, isn't it? Jason nodded proudly. That's me. You ever serve? No. Then maybe be careful making assumptions about someone who did. The yard became just a little quieter. Jason forced a laugh. Oh, come on, Colonel. We're family. This is how we talk. Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded once and walked away. That bothered Jason more than if he'd started a fight. People who love attention hate being dismissed. About half an hour later, Grandma asked if someone could help her bring dessert from inside the house. I volunteered immediately. So did Ethan. For the first time all afternoon, we found ourselves alone in Grandma's old farmhouse. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon, coffee, and fresh bread, the same way it had since I was a little girl. Grandma disappeared upstairs to grab more serving plates, leaving the two of us standing beside the counter. Ethan looked around the room before speaking. You've been avoiding me. I didn't know I was. You changed the subject every time I mentioned your service. I don't talk about it much. Most people who saw what we saw don't. I looked out the window toward the backyard. Children were chasing fireflies now. Jason was already telling another story, waving his hands like always. For a moment, I wished life really were that simple. Ethan spoke again. I spent years working with rescue squadrons. I nodded politely. I'm sure you did. I've read a lot of after-action reports. So have I. His eyes narrowed slightly. You flew rotary wing? Sometimes. Black Hawk? Sometimes. He smiled. There it is again. What? Sometimes. I couldn't help smiling. It's a useful word. It is when you're hiding. That one landed harder than I expected. Before I could answer, Grandma came back carrying a stack of plates. Conversation over. Maybe that was for the best. Outside, twilight settled over the ranch. String lights hanging between wooden poles blinked on one by one. Someone switched the music from modern country to old Johnny Cash. The younger kids sat on hay bales roasting marshmallows over a small fire pit. One of my little nieces ran over carrying a tiny paper lantern she'd made at school. She handed it to me proudly. I made this for Veterans Day, Aunt Claire. It wasn't much. Just colored paper and glue. One crooked little American flag. A badly drawn helicopter. And underneath, in childish handwriting, "Thank you for helping people." My throat tightened. She didn't know anything. She wasn't thanking me for missions. She was thanking me because I'd volunteered at her elementary school's safety day the previous fall, teaching kids what to do if someone got lost while hiking. Funny how children admire the things adults overlook. I hugged her gently. It's beautiful. Jason walked by just in time to see it. There you go. He laughed. Our family hero. The word hero dripped with sarcasm. Tell us something, Claire. He raised his voice again so everyone nearby could hear. You've been acting mysterious all day. I don't think I have. Oh, you definitely have. He took another sip of bourbon. You've never told us what you actually did in the Army. I was in the Air Force. Same difference. A few people chuckled awkwardly. I corrected him quietly. It isn't. He shrugged. Fine. So what did you do? I flew. What kind of flying? Search and rescue. Like finding lost hikers? Sometimes. There it is again. He laughed. Sometimes. Even I smiled a little, because by then I knew exactly what was coming. Jason wasn't looking for an answer. He was looking for a performance. He leaned against the picnic table and folded his arms. Okay, let's settle this. If you were really somebody. He paused dramatically, making sure everyone around him was listening. What was your call sign? The laughter faded into quiet expectation. Across the yard, I saw Ethan Brooks slowly lift his head. For the first time since he'd arrived, the entire ranch seemed to stop moving. Even the wind felt still. I looked down at the glass of sweet tea in my hand. There are some names you spend half your life trying to forget. Not because you're ashamed of them, because hearing them out loud brings back everyone who never got the chance to grow old. I closed my eyes for just a second. Then I looked up at Jason. I looked at Jason for a long second. The whole backyard had gone strangely quiet, though I don't think anyone realized it yet. Conversations had faded into the background. Even the kids roasting marshmallows had drifted closer without meaning to. They sensed what adults always sense before something important happens. I took one slow breath, not because I was nervous, but because I already knew what hearing that name would do to me. Some names aren't just names, they're doors. And once you open them, every memory waiting behind them comes rushing back. I set my glass of sweet tea on the picnic table. Harbinger, just one word, nothing more. Jason frowned. Harbinger? He repeated with a laugh. Seriously? Sounds like something out of a superhero movie. A couple of cousins let out uncertain chuckles. Then came another sound, crystal breaking against concrete. Everyone turned. Colonel Ethan Brooks had dropped his glass. It exploded across the stone patio, iced tea spreading between the chair legs, but he didn't even look down. His face had turned completely white. Not surprised, not confused, haunted, the kind of expression you only see when someone suddenly realizes a ghost is standing 20 feet away. Nobody spoke. Jason glanced from me to Ethan. Colonel? Ethan didn't answer. He took one slow step toward me, then another. His breathing had become shallow. His eyes never left mine. No, he whispered. My God, the words barely reached anyone else. You were Harbinger? I didn't answer immediately. Some questions don't need an answer. The silence already had. The wind moved gently across the pasture behind the ranch, carrying the smell of pine trees and charcoal smoke, but nobody seemed to notice anymore. Finally, I nodded once. Yes. For a moment, Ethan simply stood there. Then, without saying another word, he straightened his back. His shoulders squared automatically. Years of military discipline taking over before emotion could stop it. He raised his right hand and saluted me. Right there, in front of my grandmother, in front of my cousins, in front of everyone who had spent the afternoon laughing at me. You could have heard a pin drop. Grandma Eleanor slowly lowered the serving spoon she'd been holding. My aunt covered her mouth. Little Emma looked up at her mother and whispered, "Why is that man saluting Aunt Claire?" Nobody answered. Jason stared like someone had forgotten how to blink. What is happening?" Ethan finally lowered his hand. His voice trembled in a way I never expected from a man who had spent most of his life leading soldiers. "We were told she didn't make it home." Every eye turned toward me. I forced a small smile. Rumors travel faster than helicopters. Nobody laughed. Ethan shook his head slowly. For 23 years. He swallowed hard. I believed Harbinger died during Operation Broken Ridge. The name hit me like cold rain. Broken Ridge. I hadn't heard anyone say those words in almost 2 decades. Immediately, the memories returned. Snow, radio static, the smell of hydraulic fluid, the vibration of rotor blades shaking through my chest. Someone screaming coordinates over an overloaded frequency. Another voice praying quietly because he thought the microphone was turned off. People think memory fades. It doesn't. It simply learns patience. Jason finally found his voice. Okay, he laughed nervously. Somebody has to explain this because I have absolutely no idea what's going on. Nobody moved. Ethan looked at me first, asking permission. I sighed softly. If you're going to tell it right. He nodded. I will. He pulled out one of the folding chairs but never actually sat down. I wasn't on that mission. He looked around at my family. But half the men in my squadron knew about it. Still silence. There was a joint rescue operation in the Hindu Kush. Most people around the table had probably never even heard of the mountain range. It was winter. The weather collapsed. Visibility almost disappeared. A special operations reconnaissance team became trapped behind enemy lines. He paused. The rescue order was canceled. Jason frowned. Canceled? There wasn't supposed to be a rescue. The words landed heavily. Command believed the risk was too high. Someone quietly whispered, "So they were just left there?" Ethan nodded once. They were expected to die. Nobody touched their food anymore. The only sound came from crickets beginning their evening song. Then Ethan looked toward me again. There was one pilot who refused to accept that answer. I looked away, toward the mountains, because I already knew where this story was going. The weather report said no aircraft should fly. The intelligence officers said nobody could survive the route. The commanding staff shut down every request. He smiled sadly. Harbinger ignored all of them. Jason looked at me as though he'd never seen me before. You disobeyed orders? I answered quietly. I followed a different one. What order? The one that says you don't leave people behind. Nobody spoke. Grandma's eyes filled with tears. She had never asked me about the war. Now I understood why. Maybe she had always been afraid of the answer. Ethan continued. The helicopter entered a valley everyone else had written off. There was enemy fire. Navigation systems kept failing. The aircraft took damage. I interrupted gently. It wasn't just the aircraft. He looked at me, then nodded. No, it wasn't. For a moment we were no longer standing in Montana. We were back there, 23 years earlier, listening to alarms, watching fuel levels drop, wondering whether we'd ever see another sunrise. Jason spoke more softly now. So, did you rescue them? Ethan answered before I could. 27 men came home because she refused to turn around. Gasps spread across the yard. My cousin Mark whispered, 27. Little Emma looked confused. That's a whole classroom. I smiled sadly. Almost. Ethan looked at me. There it is. I frowned. What? Every person who survived that day tells the same story. They call you a hero. You always answer with one word. Almost. The smile disappeared from my face. Because almost isn't enough when you're counting people. I looked down at my hands. They always remember 27. My voice barely rose above a whisper. I remember 3. The entire yard froze again. 3. Nobody needed me to explain what that meant. Even Jason understood. His shoulders slowly dropped. The confidence he'd carried all afternoon disappeared. Ethan spoke quietly. She stayed in the valley nearly 30 minutes longer than anyone thought possible. She kept going back. Again, and again, and again, until there wasn't enough fuel left to try one more time. I closed my eyes. There are moments your mind keeps replaying no matter how many years pass. One radio transmission, one voice saying, "Tell my wife," then silence. Those memories don't become lighter. You simply become stronger from carrying them. Grandma reached over and gently placed her weathered hand on mine, the same hand that used to bandage, scrape knees when I was 8 years old. She didn't ask questions. She simply squeezed my fingers. That tiny gesture nearly broke me more than the entire conversation. Jason stared at the ground for what felt like forever. Finally, he looked back up. He stopped. I thought you just didn't like talking. A small laugh escaped me. I don't, but not for the reasons you imagined. The backyard remained silent, not uncomfortable anymore. Respectful. The kind of silence that only appears when people suddenly realize they've been looking at the wrong person all along. Then Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his old field jacket. He unfolded a worn photograph, the edges faded from years of being carried. He handed it to Jason. This was taken 6 months after Broken Ridge. Jason looked down. It showed nearly 30 soldiers standing together outside a military hospital. Across the bottom, in faded black marker, someone had written, "Because one pilot refused to quit." Jason slowly turned the picture over. On the back were 27 signatures, and at the very bottom, written in blue ink that had almost disappeared with time, were 5 simple words. "We still owe Harbinger everything." No one in the yard said another word. They didn't have to. For the first time that day, no one saw me as the quiet cousin who had wasted her life. They saw me as someone who had spent years carrying a burden she had never asked anyone else to carry with her. The photograph stayed in Jason's hands for a long time. Nobody reached for another drink. Nobody went back to the grill. Even the football game in the yard had quietly ended without anyone telling the kids to stop. They simply sensed the mood had changed. Funny how children can read a room better than adults sometimes. Jason ran his thumb across the faded signatures on the back of the picture. His shoulders looked smaller than they had all afternoon. "I don't understand," he finally said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Ethan. If she did all of that, why have we never heard any of it? Ethan looked toward me before answering. "Because she never wanted you to." Every face slowly turned back toward me. For years I had imagined what this moment might feel like if it ever happened. I thought maybe I'd finally feel understood, maybe proud, maybe relieved. Instead, I just felt tired, not physically. the kind of tired that settles into someone after carrying the same invisible weight for decades. I folded my hands together on the picnic table. You want the honest answer? Jason nodded. I got tired of watching people confuse curiosity with understanding. Nobody interrupted. When people hear you were in combat, they don't ask who you lost. They ask how many medals you got. They don't ask how you sleep. They ask whether you ever shot anyone. A quiet breeze pushed through the cottonwood trees behind the ranch. I stopped talking because every conversation made the people who died sound like somebody else's movie. Nobody moved. Grandma quietly reached for one of the paper napkins and dabbed her eyes. Ethan spoke softly. There's another part they should know. I immediately shook my head. Ethan, they deserve the truth. I looked toward the mountains. For years I had protected that story, not because it made me look heroic, because it made someone else look exactly like what he was. Cowardly. I'll tell it, I said. But I'll tell it my way. He nodded. Fair enough. I leaned back in the old wooden chair and stared at the string lights hanging over the backyard. They like telling stories about heroes. I smiled faintly. They rarely tell stories about paperwork. That earned a few confused looks. The mission wasn't what ended my career. The paperwork afterward did. Jason frowned. What does that mean? It means somebody needed someone to blame. Silence. The weather reports had warned command not to approve the operation. They approved it anyway. When things went wrong, they needed somebody lower in the chain. Mark looked stunned. So they blamed you? I nodded once. The official report never called it that. They used prettier words. Poor judgment. Failure to follow revised operational guidance. Excessive mission risk. I laughed once, without humor. It's amazing how polite words can destroy a career. Nobody around the table smiled. Ethan's jaw tightened. I argued, I know. So did a lot of others, I know. But politics usually outrank gratitude. That sentence seemed to settle over everyone. Jason stared at me. So, you saved 27 people and got punished? It wasn't that simple. It never is. I picked up the little paper lantern my niece had made earlier. The glue had already started peeling off one corner. Children make things that aren't perfect. Maybe that's why they're beautiful. The investigation lasted almost 11 months. I wasn't allowed to fly. I wasn't allowed near operational aircraft. I spent most of my days sitting in offices answering questions from people who'd never been anywhere near that valley. My aunt whispered, "Oh, Claire." I shrugged gently. "It happens." "No." Grandma's voice surprised everyone. It shouldn't. For 75 years, Grandma Eleanor had never raised her voice during a family gathering. Now she looked directly at every person sitting around that table. Some of you spent years calling her stubborn. Some called her strange. You all kept asking why she lived alone. Her eyes stopped on Jason. Did any of you ever ask whether she wanted? Nobody answered, because nobody had. Not really. Jason slowly rubbed both hands over his face. I honestly thought he stopped. I thought you just pushed everybody away. I did. I answered before anyone else could, but not because I hated people. I looked around the table. I couldn't stand hearing someone complain that the grocery line was too long, 5 minutes after I'd spent the night remembering 3 families who never got another phone call. Nobody knew where to look anymore. The silence wasn't awkward. It was honest. Sometimes honesty sounds exactly like silence. A pickup truck rolled slowly down the road beyond the ranch fence, country music drifting faintly through its open windows. Life outside the ranch kept moving. It always does. No matter what memories you're carrying. My niece Emma climbed into my lap without saying anything. She wrapped both little arms around my waist. Children don't always understand sadness, but they always recognize when someone needs a hug. I kissed the top of her head. Thanks, Peanut. She looked up at me. Were you scared? Every adult at the table froze. Nobody expected that question. I smiled. Every single day. But you still went? I did. Why? I looked into those curious little eyes. Because she deserved an answer simple enough for an 8-year-old to understand. Because somebody else's family was waiting for them to come home. Emma thought about that for a second. Then she nodded. That makes sense. Sometimes children understand courage better than adults because they haven't learned to complicate it yet. Jason stood up slowly. He walked a few steps away. Nobody followed him. He stopped near the old oak tree where we'd all climbed as kids. For several minutes, he simply stood there with his back to everyone. When he finally turned around, his eyes were red. "I owe you an apology." I didn't say anything. He walked closer. Not dramatically, not like somebody performing for an audience, just quietly. "I've spent years making jokes because everybody laughed. I never stopped to ask whether you were laughing too." I nodded slightly. "You weren't." "No, I'm sorry. Simple words. No excuses. No, if I hurt you. No, that's just how I am. Just, I'm sorry." Those are usually the hardest words for an adult to say. I stood and walked toward him. For a second, he looked like he expected me to stay angry. Instead, I hugged him. Not because he'd earned forgiveness, because I was tired of carrying another weight. People often think forgiveness is something you give someone else. Sometimes it's something you give yourself. When we stepped apart, Jason let out a long breath. "I don't know how to make up for 20 years. "You don't?" I smiled gently. "But tomorrow's a pretty good place to start." That seemed to lift something off his shoulders. About then, my Uncle Roy disappeared into the farmhouse. A few minutes later, he returned carrying an old wooden box. I almost forgot. He handed it to me. "I found this while cleaning the attic last month." I frowned. "I've never seen that. It belonged to your mother." Carefully, I opened the lid. Inside was a folded American flag, a few faded family photographs, and a small cloth pouch. When I untied the string, a smooth green stone rolled into my palm. Grandma smiled through her tears. "Your grandfather brought that home from Vietnam. He carried it in his pocket every day. He always said it reminded him that even rough things become smooth if they survive long enough." I rubbed the little stone between my fingers. Funny, I'd flown through sandstorms, snow, enemy fire, yet somehow a simple river stone nearly made me cry. Grandma reached over and closed my hand around it. "Keep it. Your grandpa would have wanted that." I nodded quietly. "I will." The atmosphere around the ranch had changed completely. Nobody cared about football anymore. Nobody cared about who had the biggest house, the nicest truck, or the best-paying job. Instead, cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years began pulling up chairs. Not to ask about combat, not to hear exciting stories. They asked ordinary questions. "What do you grow in your garden? Is Wyoming really that cold? Do you still bake blueberry pie from Aunt Margaret's recipe?" For the first time in years, people weren't interested in the version of me they'd invented. They were interested in the person sitting in front of them. And somehow, that felt far more meaningful than any medal I'd ever received. The rest of the evening never really returned to what it had been before. The burgers were still warm on the grill. The pie was still sitting on the picnic table. Kids eventually started laughing again, chasing each other beneath the string lights as if nothing extraordinary had happened. That's one of the things I admire most about children. They don't stay trapped inside heavy moments forever. Adults do. Children somehow know when it's time to start living again. The grown-ups, though, had changed. Not in some dramatic movie-like way. Nobody suddenly treated me like a celebrity. Honestly, I would have hated that. Instead, something much quieter happened. People slowed down. They listened more than they talked. Questions became conversations instead of interrogations. For years, every family reunion had felt like everyone was trying to fit me into a story they'd already written. The quiet cousin, the lonely veteran, the woman who disappeared into the mountains because she didn't like people. Now those labels seemed to disappear one by one. My cousin Sarah pulled a chair beside me. "I owe you an apology, too." "You don't. I do." She looked embarrassed. "I used to tell people you were probably happier staying away from the family." I smiled gently. "I was." She looked surprised. "Really? Sometimes distance is the only way people know how to heal." She nodded slowly. "I wish I'd understood that sooner." "So do I." Neither of us felt the need to say anything else. Not every conversation needs a perfect ending. Some just need honesty. A little later, Uncle Roy walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me. "No sugar. You remembered. I remember more than you think." He leaned against the fence beside me. "You know, I used to be angry." I looked over. "At me? No, at myself." He stared across the dark pasture where the horses had gathered near the barn. "When your mother passed away, I promised her I'd look after you." He sighed. "I thought giving you space was the same thing. It wasn't." I shook my head. "You gave me exactly what I needed." I disappeared. You survived. There was a difference. People often confuse the two. He placed a hand on my shoulder. I'm proud of the woman you became. That sentence hit harder than all the military stories we'd shared that evening, because it had nothing to do with helicopters, or missions, or medals. It had everything to do with being seen as a person. Across the yard, Jason had somehow become the unofficial marshmallow chef for the kids. Watching him made me smile. Every time one of the little ones burned a marshmallow, he simply laughed and helped them try again. No sarcastic comments, no audience, just patience. Growth rarely announces itself. Sometimes it looks as simple as a man choosing kindness where he once chose jokes. As the evening wound down, my youngest nephew Noah wandered over carrying his baseball glove. He couldn't have been older than 10. Aunt Claire? Yeah, buddy? Were you really scared in the helicopter? I smiled. I was. Every time? Pretty much. He thought about that. My coach says brave people aren't scared. Your coach means well, but he's wrong. He blinked. He is? Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding someone else matters more than your fear. He looked down at his glove. So, I can still be brave even if I'm scared before my baseball game. I laughed softly. That's exactly when bravery matters. He grinned. I think I understand. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I hoped he'd remember those words someday when life became harder than Little League. A few minutes later, Grandma Eleanor asked everyone to gather for one last family picture. Normally, I tried standing somewhere near the edge. Old habits. Before I could step aside, Jason stopped me. No, he smiled. You're in the middle this year. I don't need to be. I know. But you belong there. There was something different about the way he said it. Not because of what I'd done 23 years ago. Because I was family. The photographer counted. 1, 2, just before he reached 3, little Emma grabbed my hand. Without thinking, I squeezed hers. The camera flashed. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the quiet relative hiding in the back row. I simply felt home. Later that night, after most of the guests had left, I helped Grandma carry empty dishes into the farmhouse. She moved slower these days, but she still refused to let anyone do all the work. Some things never change. While drying one of the old mixing bowls, she smiled without looking up. Your grandpa would have liked today. You think so? He always said people reveal who they really are after the truth shows up. I laughed quietly. He said that? No, she smiled. He probably would have if he'd thought of it. We both laughed. It felt good, simple, real. When I walked back outside, Colonel Ethan Brooks was standing beside his SUV with the driver's door open. The ranch had become quiet. The string lights still glowed above the empty picnic tables. Crickets filled the silence. He waited until I reached him. I've been thinking. That's usually dangerous. He laughed. Still the same sense of humor, occupational hazard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his pocket and handed me a small challenge coin. One side carried the emblem of an old combat search and rescue unit. The other side had only 4 engraved words. Leave nobody behind. I've carried this for 15 years. I can't take that. I wasn't giving it to Harbinger. He looked directly at me. I'm giving it to Claire. That somehow mattered even more. I turned the coin over in my hand. The edges were worn smooth from years in someone's pocket, much like Grandpa's green stone. Funny how the things we carry become part of us. Before climbing into his SUV, Ethan looked back one last time. You know, there are still men who tell your story. I smiled faintly. I hope they leave out the parts where I crashed into trees. He laughed. They tell the important parts. I leaned against the truck beside him. For years I wanted people to forget. And now? I looked toward the farmhouse. Warm light spilled from the kitchen windows. Inside, I could see Grandma hugging Emma goodnight. Jason was stacking folding chairs beside Uncle Roy. Sarah was wrapping leftover pie for everyone to take home. Ordinary people, living ordinary moments. Moments that 27 families almost never had. I don't need anyone to remember me. I said it quietly because I finally knew it was true. I just hope they remember each other. Ethan nodded. I think that's the best answer I've heard in a long time. He climbed into the SUV. The headlights swept across the ranch before disappearing down the gravel road. I stood there for another minute, listening to the night. Years ago, I thought healing meant forgetting. I spent a long time trying to lock every painful memory behind a closed door. What I eventually learned was much simpler. Healing isn't forgetting. It's remembering without letting the memory decide who you become. The next morning, before driving back to Wyoming, I stopped at the small cemetery where my parents were buried. Grandma had packed me a paper bag with leftover biscuits, homemade blackberry jam, and 2 slices of blueberry pie for the road. That was her love language, feeding people. I placed Grandpa's green stone on top of the headstone for a moment before slipping it back into my pocket. "I think I finally came home," I said quietly. The wind moved gently through the pine trees. No dramatic sign, no miracle, just peace. As I climbed into my truck, my phone buzzed. A message from Jason. "Drive safe. Next month we're fixing Grandma's fence. Don't argue. You're coming. Family actually wants you there." I laughed. Then another message appeared. A photo from last night's family picture. Someone had already framed it with a simple caption. "Some heroes wear medals. The best ones simply come home for dinner." I looked at the picture for a long moment before starting the engine. Maybe the greatest victory was never flying through impossible weather. Maybe it wasn't bringing 27 soldiers home. Maybe it wasn't surviving a career that almost broke me. Maybe the greatest victory was much quieter than that. It was sitting around an old wooden picnic table, no longer hiding pieces of myself. It was watching assumptions disappear without humiliating the people who made them. It was accepting an apology without demanding someone suffer first. Life has taught me something I wish I'd understood much earlier. People will always judge the chapter they can see. They have no idea what happened in the pages before it. That's why kindness matters. That's why listening matters. And that's why the strongest people I've ever known were never the loudest ones in the room. They were the ones who carried impossible burdens with quiet dignity, then chose compassion anyway. If this story leaves you with one thought, let it be this: you never truly know what someone has survived. So before you laugh, before you judge, before you decide someone's life looks ordinary, remember that the quietest person at the table may have already fought battles you'll never have to imagine. And sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't proving people wrong. It's living with enough grace that, when the truth finally arrives, it doesn't need you to say a single word. Some stories remind us that the deepest wounds don't come from being underestimated. They come from being judged by people who never took the time to know who we really are. Life has a way of putting us in situations where we're misunderstood, overlooked, or reduced to a version of ourselves that isn't true. Some people fight to prove everyone wrong. Others choose silence. But sometimes, the strongest response isn't defending yourself at all. It's living with integrity until the truth speaks louder than any explanation ever could. This story is a reminder that our worth isn't measured by other people's opinions, their assumptions, or the labels they place on us. It's measured by our character, the choices we make when no one is watching, and the kindness we continue to show even after we've been hurt. As the saying goes, actions speak louder than words. Every person you meet is carrying a story you cannot see, a burden you may never understand, and battles they rarely talk about. That's why compassion matters, listening matters, taking a moment before judging someone matters. And if you're the one facing unfair criticism or feeling unseen today, don't let someone else's opinion become your identity. Keep moving forward. Keep doing what's right. In time, your life will tell your story better than your words ever could. As another old saying reminds us, the cream always rises to the top. Truth has a way of revealing itself, and genuine character never stays hidden forever. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts or tell us about a time when you were misunderstood, but chose to rise above it. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more powerful stories about resilience, hope, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. Until next time, take care of yourself, be kind to those around you, and may you always find peace after life's hardest storms.